Doc on the Run. We help injured runners run.
Can a stress fracture spread from one bone to another? That's a great question, and that's what we're talking about today on the Doc on the Run podcast. All right, now one thing that's really demoralizing if you get a stress fracture is to spend a bunch of time in a fracture walking boot, to spend several weeks not running, not training, not doing anything, and then go get something like an MRI and be shocked and horrified when the doctor says, well, not only do you have a stress fracture in that bone, it looks like you've got a stress fracture in another bone as well. And so if you think this stress fracture might have spread, well, it could, but not the way an infection would. This is not a contagious thing, but there is a way that you can actually get inflammation in a neighboring bone that happens as a result of getting an original stress fracture. So for example, let's say that you have a third metatarsal stress fracture. So if you have a third metatarsal stress fracture and it hurts when you walk and it hurts when you train, it hurts when you ride a bike, it hurts when you're doing any kind of workout, but because you're an athlete, you don't really notice it so much. Well, what you're going to do normally is you're going to limp. You're going to compensate. You're going to walk in ways that actually put that pressure someplace else. And the first three metatarsals, the one that goes to the big toe, the second toe, and the middle toe, well, they all line up with the navicular that lines up with the talus bone. Why is that important? Well, that basically acts as independent suspension from the other two that go to the pinky toe and the fourth metatarsal. So the fourth and fifth are like your lateral suspension, and the other three are your medial suspension. And so if you get a stress fracture on the third, and then you tilt your foot to take stress off of the first, second, and third, all that pressure shoots over to the fourth. And so you might get an MRI that has a real stress fracture on the third metatarsal and then shows some inflammation in the bone that's really a stress reaction that's kind of heading toward a stress fracture just because you've been compensating so much. The other way is that it spreads from the metatarsal out into the toe. The way that can happen is that if you have, let's say, a stress fracture at the neck of the metatarsal, right near the knuckle, right near the head of the metatarsal, it can get so inflamed that you actually get something we call reactive edema, where the first bone in the toe, the first of those three, the one called the proximal phalanx bone, well, it actually starts to become inflamed just because it's in the neighborhood of all that noise. And so that's not really a concern because stress fractures in the toes don't really turn into a problematic thing very much at all. So it's more concerning that if you're getting multiple metatarsals that are joining in the party and they're getting stress reactions or stress fractures as well, that's a totally different story. But it can spread. It's not that the infectious process or the inflammatory process is damaging those bones. It's usually because it's either reactive inflammation just because it's in the same area, or you're compensating and you're shifting the forces away from that primary injury, and now you're starting to get a secondary injury because you're putting too much stress on another injury. But that's a great question. So that's the way that the stress can move from one bone to a neighboring bone and look like your stress fracture is kind of spreading from one bone to another. So make sure you remove the stress if you want to continue training, but the name of the game is make sure that you actually keep your fitness as you heal that stress fracture. That's the most important thing if you're a runner who wants to get back to running as quickly as possible.
Doc on the Run. We help injured runners run.